We are very excited today to be joined by our speakers from Beirut. Thank you all so much for being here. Our first speaker is Islam Khatib, who is a Palestinian feminist based in Beirut. And we also have Sigrida Brihanu, who is the projects manager at Enya Lenya, a community-based feminist activist organization working on migrant domestic workers issues and general women's issues in Lebanon and Ethiopia. Sigrida has been working in Lebanon for almost 7 years and is currently based in Beirut. And finally, Karim Shayib, who is a journalist and researcher in Beirut. Karim reports for local media organization, The Public Source, and is a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. Keep in mind that all our speakers are joining us from Beirut today, where internet and electricity connections can sometimes cut out, so do please bear with us should we have any technical difficulties. So, before we start the conversation with our speakers, I'm going to give a brief introduction to today's topic. On October 17th, 2019, hundreds of thousands of protesters hit the streets across Lebanon, demanding change and calling for the corrupt political system and the ruling elite upholding it to be dismantled. Lebanon's political rulers refused to yield, and the country is now facing multiple crises, including a devastating economic recession, which has led to a shortage of food in Lebanon's supermarkets, as well as the inability to access savings in the banks. The spread of COVID-19, with over 100,000 confirmed cases since March, and a deadly blast in August at Beirut's port, which killed around 200 people, injured 6,500, and has left 300,000 homeless. Although everyone in Lebanon has been deeply affected by these crises, migrant workers and refugee communities who have historically been marginalised and legally discriminated against by the state have been especially hard hit. Lebanon has a population of over 6.8 million, according to the World Bank. Almost a quarter of this number live without citizenship and are denied essential rights and access to the state's resources. Today, there are 250,000 migrant workers in Lebanon, mainly from Asia and Africa, who came to the country hoping to make a better living for themselves and their families, only to be trapped in the state's dystopian Kafala system, which effectively renders them powerless and imprisoned within the country. As the situation has worsened, thousands of these workers have been denied their wages, have been made unemployed, and left stranded without shelter. At the same time, Lebanon hosts the largest number of refugees per capita in the world, with 1.5 million Syrian refugees, much smaller refugee populations from Iraq and Sudan, as well as an older Palestinian refugee community. Most of these Palestinian refugees are the descendants of Palestinians who were expelled or forced to flee Palestine in 1948 during the Nakba, the creation of the State of Israel, and the ethnic cleansing of more than 400 Palestinian cities, towns, and villages. According to UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinians in the Near East, Lebanon is now home to around 470,000 Palestinian refugees, although the actual number is contested, as this is only the figure of those counted by UNRWA living in Lebanon's 12 official refugee camps. Many refugees either no longer live in the camps or have fled the country altogether. This number also includes around 30,000 Palestinian refugees from Syria, who are now facing their second or third mass displacement. As with Syrian refugees, Palestinians in Lebanon are classified as stateless and are subject to numerous restrictions which affect their ability to work in specific professions, to own property, and to travel freely. Before the crises of the last year, the situation for the community was already precarious, as UNRWA, whose services most Palestinians rely on, including for employment, education, healthcare, and food, was itself experiencing a huge shortfall in funding, which was further impacted by President Trump's politicized cuts to the UN agency. The challenges faced by the community have now only worsened. Whilst we will touch upon the plight of other refugee and migrant communities where relevant, this talk will focus specifically on the situation of migrant workers confronting the Kafala system and Palestinian refugees, both during this current crisis and within the broader context of Lebanese state violence. I'll be starting the discussion with our speakers in a moment, but before that, we'd like to invite you all to please consider supporting some of the brilliant and resilient organizations that are doing critical and crucial work for these communities on the ground. We'll be posting links to these in the chat. So moving on to the discussion with our speakers, I'll begin by posing my first question to Karim. So Karim, if you can please speak to us about the background of the situation. Can you tell us about the Lebanese political system and how Lebanon came to find itself in the current crisis it is now experiencing?
First of all, thank you so much for having me, and I'm really happy to be sharing a space with Islam and Sigrida. So absolutely, I think it's really important to start with talking about the Lebanese political system, which generally speaking is, as it's known as the sectarian system, which is a very fragile sort of power sharing balance between different sects across Lebanon, from Sunnis and Shia Muslims to various Christian denominations to Druze and otherwise. And most people, when they think about the sectarian system, they think of, the president in Lebanon has to be a Christian, the prime minister a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of parliament a Shia Muslim. And of course, this sort of applies to all sorts of other positions in government as well. And I think what's even more important than that, other than the fact that this was all a gentleman's agreement and nothing in the constitution or anything along likes of that, it doesn't just impact politics at the top, right? Sectarianism seeps into every aspect of life in Lebanon, whether it's employment in the public sector and then de facto the private sector as well, social relations, politics on the ground, and the context of this conversation, Lebanon abiding by basic human rights, because sectarianism seeps into that as well. So Lebanon has always sort of had this power sharing dilemma between different sects or different elites of these different sects, and they try to maintain this fragile power sharing balance based on an old census that has not been updated for a very long time. We're talking about pre-independence. And of course, it's not accurate to reality today, but they try to maintain that. They've modified it a bit at the end of the Civil War in 1990, but point is it's based on, demographic engineering almost. Now, this is where things get a bit, it gets even more tragic, in my opinion. So, for example, Lebanon did not, ratify the Geneva Convention, because if they actually fulfill their obligations towards taking care of refugees, then this could mean a shift in demographics in Lebanon. And it really boils down to that at the end of the day. And the best example of this, of how they handled this issue, was when was the Syrian refugee crisis in Lebanon. And it's not a crisis because there are Syrian refugees here. It's a crisis because they've gone through hell and back. So Syrian refugees were really left at the hands of the UNHCR to look after them and other international organizations. The Lebanese government took a very laissez-faire approach. They said, we don't have a position on the uprising and subsequent war in Syria. So, what they did the bare minimum not to interfere and to kind of absolve this kind of responsibility, because they know that, and they've said it, and I'm sure many people have seen our ex-foreign minister Jabran Basil talk about it by saying that the refugees are not just a security or economic threat, but also a demographic threat. And why is that the case? It's because they're mostly from a certain religious sect, and that if Lebanon abides by its human rights obligations and lets them live like human beings, allows them to work, allows them the freedom of transportation or freedom of movement, then they will have obligations to allow them to stick around. And Lebanon, as we're going to touch on with Palestinians in Lebanon, they have been here for generations, and there is no pathway to civil rights. They're restricted when it comes to employment and so on. So that would be an additional sort of burden on the sector, which Lebanon relies on entirely. So really the sectarian system in Lebanon is, in my opinion, it was a key hurdle to human rights in Lebanon, as long as we think of as long as we maintain a system that wants to kind of maintain this framework. Now, when it comes to the economic crisis in Lebanon, how we ended up in this mess, Lebanon went through a tragic civil war for 15 years, from 1975 till 1990. And when the civil war ended, as you know, Lebanon maintained or let's say introduced economic policies and a reconstruction plan, which was one not sustainable and not necessarily built in the interest of the social good. So Lebanon, basically, the entire reconstruction process was built on privatizations and bolstering a service sector, mostly of banking and luxury tourism and so on, and of course lots of patchwork fiscal policies in order to keep things afloat, including the notorious pegging of the local currency to the dollar. Now, at first, one would say, okay, this is a temporary measure to keep things from going nuts, hyperinflation, and so on, and to keep things stable. But these are the kinds of policies that we stuck around with since 1990, for decades. And at one point, we just realized we're not producing anything, and none of the money is being invested into social services, a viable social security, affordable housing, good infrastructure, productive economic sectors. And at one point, much of the money that we relied on to come into the country was from expats who were working abroad when the GCC was booming, who would send money back home. Suddenly, we had a dollar shortage, and people started to withdraw their money from the banks really quickly because they started to impose withdrawal limits on US currency. And of course, over time, things just kept getting worse with unemployment soaring. And suddenly we developed a black market, which now basically rules. We had several exchange rates, now we have a black market. And so it shows that, our economic crisis is systematic. It's built on decades of poor policy. And of course, on a political system, which puts sectarian representation and maintaining this sort of balance over any sort of fair and effective policy that brings out the best for society in Lebanon or the people living in Lebanon. And I think that's one way of kind of tying it all together. Why is that the case? Well, think of it like this. If you're hiring people for the public sector, or you want to vote for people, but you have to maintain certain quotas, then by default, you're not bringing in the best people who are suitable for the job. And so it shows how the sectarian system seeps into everything. It impacts policymakers. It impacts, of course, human rights, because everything is based on this fragile demographic. So it's, in short, it's a really, really big mess, and the crisis is systematic. And it all comes from the way Lebanon is structured. It's not an issue of repealing a few laws, amending a few laws, introducing something into the mix. It's really about the only solution really to all of this is to tackle this broken system that we have. And unfortunately, this broken system has created a massive a cocktail of marginalized communities, each suffering in different ways than each other. The way Palestinians, for example, are only under sort of the auspices of UNRWA is different than Syrians who are sort of stuck between UNHCR and the local municipality, depending on where they are. If you're a Syrian refugee in Tripoli, it's a different experience than if you're in a certain place. And of course, with Lebanese, working class people, for example, it depends on your political houses who will provide you the services in exchange for political loyalty. And of course, with migrant workers, it's the Kafala system, where it really is a case of modern day slavery. And there's no two ways about it. So I hope this kind of is a good sort of overview of things, and hopefully it ties things together one way or another.
Yes, thank you so much, Karim. Thank you for kind of describing and explaining the fragility and precariousness of the system as it is, and kind of for explaining the frameworks and the motivations that have kind of created the system in its current form. So I would like to pose the next question to starting with you, Islam. If you can speak to us a little about the state of the Palestinians in Lebanon today. Where are they based? And then moving on, we'll ask Zagrida to also speak about the migrant workers. Who are they in Lebanon? Which countries do they come from, and what kind of employment do they typically work in? So we'll just start with part one of the question with you, Islam.
Yeah, I'm unmuted, right? Yeah, so thank you, Karim, and thank you everyone for organizing this conversation. I think few points that Karim made, we will have to go back on later. I feel like he mentioned a few points I would like to highlight, but that's for like the rest of the conversation anyways. So as you said about the numbers, I would also like to just have a quick disclaimer that any number I mention, any percentage, is one that I got from UNRWA or from Palestinian researchers or journalists. And I do not believe that these numbers convey in any form the complex lived realities of Palestinians, because more often than not, Palestinians outside camps are excluded, or even inside camps are excluded, depending on different positionalities. So I will, as you said, I will stick to talking about the general socio-political framework of where we are. So as you obviously mentioned, that 53%, according to UNRWA, 53% of Palestinians in Lebanon reside in the 12 official camps and Palestinian gatherings. And approximately 500,000 refugees have been living in Lebanon, 72 years of living as refugees and 44 to 45 years of complete socio-political erasure and silence as a collective punishment, which is, to me, like the tenet of the post-war, quote-unquote, era in Lebanon. And I think that two examples I would give to sort of give a glimpse on the state of Palestinians today would be first the fact that the first spark of protest and revolt and the first actual protest against the current reality, which Karim summarized, began in Palestinian camps last year in July 2019. And that is not to say, however, that these protests led to the Lebanese uprising or are, deeply linked together, but just to say that it was more of an alarming sign of what was yet to come. And as both of you mentioned, many Palestinians rely on UNRWA services, whether it's healthcare, education, or recently with COVID-19 related services, whether testing or treatments. But another example would be about the state of Palestinians today would be the fact that ongoing negotiations for strikes to be led by UNRWA workers and employees, because last week UNRWA announced that they may not be able to continue their operations and might have to delay and will actually delay payment for workers. And previously, many teachers were subjected to pay cuts. So this sort of tells us a lot about how things are going, whether in terms of politics of aid or how things are going in general. And with COVID-19, I mean, of course, a lot has been said about COVID-19, but what's always missing from the conversation is that COVID-19 threatens the informal economies built by Palestinians inside camps and gatherings. And here we're talking about vegetable vendors, we're talking about construction workers, day-to-day workers who have had their livelihood threatened. And we have like the very small percentage of Palestinians who work in the private or the nonprofit sectors who have had like their jobs either, they have been expelled from their jobs, the companies where they work at have been shut down, or they have been, expelled altogether, because it's easier to expel, a Palestinian worker, unfortunately. And the aid that's been given to Palestinians in general, whether by UNRWA or by Palestinian factions, is not even sufficient to last for a week, with the rise of prices and with lack of any sort of access to any affordable housing or healthcare. And refugee aid is as well, has its own sort of process that is very corrupt and that is very conditional, but that's a different conversation, I think. And amid all of this, Palestinians are also witnessing a global anti-Palestinian discourse that is also deeply rooted within Lebanese laws and society. And this discourse is only intensifying with no end in sight, even in a raging pandemic, because this is the perfect opportunity to sort of, discriminate between the deserving people, those who deserve treatments and those who do not. And this also rings true, as Karim mentioned, to thousands of Palestinian refugees who came from Syria, who are not only seen as illegal immigrants, but sort of also stripped from Palestinian identity. Sorry, I meant illegal refugees, but also stripped of their Palestinian identity, because the legality of their status is also ambiguous. But I know that a lot of people can talk about this more than more than I could say. So all of this sort of created this, this context where you cannot exactly pinpoint one cause to why the state of Palestinians is like it is today. But I sort of highlighted these two examples to sort of talk about how things have shifted since last year with the crisis and with the protests. So, and of course we'll expand on the policies later on, but this is sort of what from my position, is what I would describe, the state of Palestinians today.
Cited very effectively the complexities of the lived experiences, the various Palestinian communities. And now I would like to address the question to Sigrid about the migrant workers in Lebanon. So again, which countries do they come from, and what kind of employment do they typically find themselves employed in Lebanon?
Hello. First of all, I want to say thank you for this opportunity and for giving us this time to talk about it. And as they mentioned a bit, like the domestic workers or the immigrant domestic workers who's working in this country, they come from Africa, Philippines, Madagascar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, from different countries. So they are based here in Lebanon and working their work position as working as a domestic workers. When we start from the name, in this country, a domestic worker isn't a work. I mean, the way how the system or the Lebanese people, the way how they don't respect the domestic work as a work. So that's put us in a bad position. And the system and this country system will not protect the domestic workers, and the job that they do, it's a domestic work is a work that based in house, like cleaning, working, and also working and cleaning in different places which is outside of the house, and different companies like inside the bank and different places. So when those people works in that position, the system it's excluded from Lebanon labor law protection and their status. The country is regulated by the Kafala system. Because of the Kafala system, and many domestic workers they are not living in a good position. Before even the economic crisis, which is the economic crisis began back in 2019 in October. But before the economic crisis, even those immigrant domestic workers, they are not treated well because of the system. And the Kafala system is a shadow for the bad abuser. There's many abuses, like non-payment of salary, they are not getting their wage, and there is no privacy, which is they don't treat a domestic workers as a human being. That's the main problem in this country. Also, the system will not care about the domestic workers. So the immigrant domestic workers who's working in Lebanon, they come from different country and working here in Lebanon, which is facing the employers' abuses and not getting paid on time, and being like through a depression because of they don't have freedom to move. I mean, they don't have day off, and that's the basic problem. And also there are not everybody's not the same. There are bad abusers, bad employers, which is they abuse them sexually, mentally, and physically. That problem is before even the economic crisis. But after the economic crisis began, that revolution things come, and me as an activist, I used to go down to protest, and even which is they said that I don't have a right to protest. We are the domestic workers and we are going through hell, and we have the right to protest, but they didn't let us even to protest. That's why I left from the revolution. In my opinion, the revolution is for everybody, right? But the way how they treat us they act just like for Lebanese people. When you work for the change, you work for everybody. Yeah, we are all women. I mean, we are all women. Like, you fight for women, not like for Lebanese people. So after the economic crisis, there's no money, no work, and the problems, it's becoming worse. And the domestic workers who used to work inside their employer house, they are not getting their salary, and they cannot able to provide for the live out workers. They cannot able to provide for the rent and for medical, and many things is happening. And yeah, this is the basic problem in this country. I mean, we can talk about a lot, but yeah, this is what I have. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sigrid. Now, I think I'll begin the next question with you again, Sigrid, please. If you can speak to us, you've mentioned in your previous response the Kafala system. Can you please give us an idea, what is the Kafala system? What does it mean for migrant workers? And then I'll move the question on to Islam to speak about the specific state policies affecting Palestinians and other refugee communities as well. But yes, please go ahead, Sigrid.
So, as Karim mentioned at the beginning, the Kafala system is a modern-day slavery, which is we are living in 21st century, and we are practicing the system. It's for me, it's like going back and living, and under the sponsorship shadow. I mean, the Lebanese people and the system, it's comparable with the Kafala system. The Kafala system that makes a domestic workers to not have a freedom, to live a life as a human being. I mean, all of us, we are human beings, and we have to have that freedom of movement or do whatever we want in the country, as long as we came from long while from, we are coming from different countries and coming here working to gain money to change our future life as other Lebanese people. Even the Lebanese people, they are traveling from to different countries. The reason why they are traveling is to make money to change their future life. So we are all in the same level, just because of our skin color or because of. First of all, what I want to say, they have to respect that the domestic work is a work. They have to accept that, and they have to respect that, and they have to treat as a human being. They shouldn't treat, they treat their pets like dog and cat. They treat well more than the domestic workers, which is that they have to fix, I don't know in what miracle they have to abolish the system. The Kafala system is a chain that ties to not move or to not do whatever you want. I mean, it's like, it's really hard even having and living under the Kafala system. I mean, we are not exaggerating or we are not talking story. It's real. It's happening now in 2020. Okay, if the employer, she doesn't pay your salary for years, nobody will ask. Okay, if there's many abuses going on inside the house, nobody will ask or protect the domestic worker. Even if she left the house, she's the criminal. Nobody will treat her as a victim. So this is the system.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's very hard to hear, but it's I think you've articulated very, very well the reality on the ground under this Kafala system. And now, if I can pose the second part of the question to you, Islam, to speak on specific state policies that also affect Palestinians and kind of other refugee communities like Syrians in Lebanon.
Okay. I was just wondering if maybe Sigrida could also like expand on the conditions of the kafala system. I feel like a lot of people are asking, or we just leave it for later.
Yeah, we can come back and talk a little bit about that. Yeah.
Okay. So when talking about laws and policies in Lebanon, to me, it's very important to note that these frameworks, legal frameworks, were modified along with the new shifts in the Palestinian-Lebanese relationship history. So to me, it's also important to understand that the institutional racism in Lebanon should not be seen as only xenophobia, but should be understood as anti-Palestinian in particular. Because this is also this is the result of four phases that I sort of see as four phases in the history of the relationship of the Palestinian community with the Lebanese state and other Lebanese actors. So when it comes to Palestinian refugees, the Lebanese law is sort of ambiguous because Palestinians are seen as a special group of foreigners who are, however, denied basic rights that are given to, regular foreigners. And up until 2010, Palestinians were not, they were not mentioned in any legal text or law. So this sort of ambiguity did not only deprive Palestinian refugees from, basic rights that are enjoyed by other foreigners, but also have led to this sort of complex, multi-layered reality in which you really do not know how to navigate the system or how to exist within the system. And it also denied a lot of rights, that are related from international conventions, which is not a point that I would focus on a lot. I would rather focus on the local sort of framework. So in June, let's speak more recently. In June 2019, Lebanon's Ministry of Labor announced a campaign to fight foreign illegal labor, and to put it in other terms, it was a crackdown on illegal foreign workers with special focus on Syrian and Palestinian refugees. It was targeting those who do not have work permits, which are already very difficult to obtain and have a very racist hierarchy where it is not where it's not acknowledged that a Palestinian could be in a leader position, in a sort of admin position. So the way these things are organized and the way the papers you have to provide to get a work permit is sort of impossible. And it was not surprising because it was already in place. They just reminded us of it. So it wasn't really a new law, but rather a new campaign to sort of remind people that, hey, we're here. So as you've mentioned, and as I've mentioned, and Karim have mentioned before, Lebanon denies Palestinian refugees many civil, economic, and social rights under the pretext of rejecting naturalization of Palestinians or, Tawtiyan, and rejecting settlement. And here is one point that I would like to highlight is that they do not really say we want to protect we want to protect the right of return. It's more of we want you to protect your own right of return. So don't demand this or your right of return will be in danger. But it's also important, I think, to me, to also understand that even if these laws were modified, even if, let's say, Palestinians were allowed to work in all professions, freedom of movement, no more control on exit and entry in Palestinian camps, no more apartheid walls in Al-Hilwa, and all of these policies, let's just say they were gone. The question remains of what are the true opportunities available to Palestinians in Lebanon if access to public education and healthcare is restricted, and if Palestinians' right to access labor, whether in private or non-profit sectors, is also conditional and tied to how assimilated you are as a Palestinian within the Lebanese society. So I feel like any talk about this, reforming laws or changing these laws would be futile, because we cannot talk about them as the only barrier and cannot talk about them as if they exist in vacuum. So to me, these policies, we have to understand them as measures taken to ensure that Palestinians remain subjected to the post-wars collective punishment. And the laws in place don't only ensure that Palestinians don't have access to public education and public healthcare and they have access to public education, but it's very restricted. But it's not about just access to public services. They also aim at isolating Palestinians. For example, Palestinians cannot work in professions that require affiliation to a particular syndicate because the bylaws of syndicate organizations require that members hold a Lebanese citizenship. This does not only allow Palestinians to be exploited, that if they were employed, for example, but it also isolates them from any form of labor organizing. Now, of course, these syndicates now are corrupt, sectarian and racist, but when these laws were put in place, these syndicates were actually pretty progressive, and they've put these laws in action. So this is a point that I would always want us to understand, that when these laws were put in place, it wasn't something to just, just racism. It was particularly anti-Palestinian. And again, there are a lot of policies in place that also kind of end any ties you have here. So, for example, you cannot, it prohibits you from owning property, right? But it's not this is not the only issue I see with this law. This law also does not allow Palestinians to sort of inherit property as descendants. So, as a result, the state confiscates the property. And Palestinians cannot also bring building materials to the camps, but this is all of it just to say that even any sort of ties that are very materialistic to this place are severed as well. But I think I can expand on more of this in why these policies put in place later on. But I just want to summarize that all of these laws are not in vacuum, are not the only barrier, and are not just, random. They were not random at all. So.
Yes, no, I think, the idea that it's not a byproduct of existing kind of systems and laws. It's an intentional kind of by design outcome that I think Palestinians find themselves with other communities, of course, refugees and workers. Karim, is there anything you would like to add to this discussion?
I think Islamists agreed, covered everything necessary. But yes, absolutely. I think it's not an issue of modifying laws, right? These laws were, as Islam said, they were put into place for a certain reason. It's to prevent opportunity of any sort of, for lack of a better term, any sort of integration or inclusion. Let's say inclusion is a better word in my opinion. Inclusion in society, to keep them as an other and to keep them isolated. This was definitely, it's an anti-Palestinian, it's a racist, it's systematic racism at its worst, frankly. And this is kind of why you see it that way. And of course, there is sectarian connotations as well, but there's also class connotations as well. There are, for example, those of the upper classes and of certain segments of society did have a pathway to citizenship a long time ago. Others were just left in isolation. So it's classist, it's racist, it's incredibly systematic and completely. And even if we change the laws, it's also about the social relations, because this has been going on since 1948, since the Nakba, right? So one thing is to change the law, other thing is to change the practice of it. And as we've seen in before, when we try to break down institutionalized racist systems, the law is one thing, but then the rest of it's how do you break the toxic ties? And unfortunately, that's going to take a while for Lebanon because it's systematic.
Yes, thank you, Karim. Now, for the next question, I will be posing it to all our speakers, but I will start with Islam again. Karim touched on this just now and previously, and this kind of idea that this is a layered, intertwined, very complex set of rules and a system that's designed to discriminate. What, in your opinion, is the purpose of these legalized systems of discrimination for non-Lebanese communities in Lebanon? If I can begin with you, Islam, and then pose the same question to the other two speakers after.
Okay, I mean, to me, it's also important to see how public discourses around Palestinians have been shaped and how they currently are. So when we talk about Palestinian camps are viewed as a space of exception, right? It's not seen as a place of accommodation. It's not seen as a place of continued memory. It's not seen as a place or even an economic space. It's sort of seen as a space where political factions exercise power. And this space has been demonized, and the demonization of this space did not only harm those who live inside it, but also those who live outside it. So I'm starting with this point to say that this discourse has made all of us justify the racist policies and anti-Palestinian policies, and we justify them to say that these policies are being put in place to not allow us to be resettled in Lebanon, against Tawtin, against the naturalization of Palestinians, because it's in one part it is true. Tawtin has been used as a scarecrow to implant public phobia against giving Palestinians their rights. But this sort of justification has put us in a place where every debate about Palestinian civil and economic rights, from those who believe that we deserve rights and those who don't, should begin with affirming that the objective of any debate or any action or any sort of discussion we should start with affirming that we do not want to be resettled, we do not want the Tawtin, and this sort of cuts conversations on why these laws are put in place and turns the conversation around rights into a conversation about short-term humanitarian or security plans. So this is why I will not focus on this point, because I know that it is sort of expected to talk about, naturalization of Palestinians. What I would rather focus about is to understand how these racist measures are collective punishment. Because from where I'm standing, I believe that to understand these policies, we have to understand the phases that have been served in Lebanon's relationship with the Palestinian community. To me, I see I see 4 phases of this relationship and how it shifted and how these laws came into place along with these shifts. For the 2 decades following the Palestinians' arrival to Lebanon following Nakba, the Lebanese establishment used coercion to suppress any attempts at social and political organization. And then subsequent changes in the Arab world and the rise of the armed Palestinian liberation movement, sort of allowed Palestinians to assert their national identities. I mean, of course, there's a whole conversation around identities, but what I'm trying to say is that this gave a space to revolt against the subservient status that Palestinians were put in upon their arrival. And then following the war of 1973, there was a direct confrontation between the Lebanese state and Palestinians. And as already mentioned, there are many factors determining why this happened, so I won't go onto this part, and I won't exactly go on the civil war and why, this sort of why I feel like I'm doing this, to not talk about it. But in the post-war period, the publicized image of Palestinian refugees deteriorated, right? They became demonized, as I mentioned earlier. And Palestinians were viewed as outlaws, but also as recipients of aid. So there were 2 conversations going on about Palestinians all the time, either completely demonized, either completely fetishized and seen as only recipient of aids, as passive agents, and both are racist and both are clearly anti-Palestinian. But today, this relationship is shifting because the camp's uprising in 2019 reintroduced Palestinians as active agents, have reintroduced conversation related to Palestinian agency, around the role of the PLO, around the role of the Palestinian factions. So these policies that were put in place to silence and completely erase any form of Palestinian agency, any form of Palestinian true autonomous political organizing, are now being challenged or have been challenged during the uprising until, whatever happened. But for now, to me, as to summarize, to sort of, because I feel like I'm all over the place, but to summarize, this anti-Palestinian, policies were put as collective punishment following the war, were put as a way to silence any form of autonomous organizing within the country, were put due to, geopolitics. I don't like this term, but this is like a sort of summary. I'm just like inviting all of us to rethink about how we talk about laws and policy and how we view them in general.
Yeah, thank you very much, Islam. That was very enlightening, actually. I think for me, it's very interesting to consider those aspects of these laws and why they were put in place as well. And I'd like to invite, please, Sigrid to answer the question. I'll just remind you again, what are the specific state policies within this kind of discriminatory system, and how, in your opinion, Sigrida, what's the purpose of these systems for specifically the migrant worker communities in Lebanon?
Okay, thanks. So as I tried to explain at the beginning, in my opinion, even the country and the people, they are comfortable with the system, which is they are having those workers inside their house, and they can use us like slave, because there's no law to protect them, and nobody will talk about the domestic workers, which is this came for years. I mean, they practiced it for years back, and now, I mean, nobody used to talk about the immigrant domestic workers in Lebanon. As I know, this, I think it starts back in 2016 maybe, because since 2016 I start with the different organization, which is activists. They start protesting just to abolish the system, which is takes time to abolish the system. I don't think they will abolish the system, because in 2019 we start working on something with the ILO, which is they try to have the new contract. If you have the information, I don't know. We work on new contract. I mean, they work on the contract, and they invite us to give a feedback about the contract, which is the old contract. It's written in Arabic, and we don't know what does it mean. We just sign blindly, and we work on the contract, and we see we had a panel, and we discuss about it, which is if they respect the law, this contract, I mean, it might bring a change. That was our hope, but 3 weeks ago, maybe, I don't know, I heard, I mean, I saw a written in Twitter that saying they reject the new contract on the courts. That's break my heart, which is they are happy with the system. They are happy, how many domestic workers they are committing suicide in past, I don't know how many years. Even I saw in my eyes one domestic worker, she committed suicide because she cannot able to leave the country because of her sponsor didn't give her permission. She's the victim, and her employer, she go and she accused her, saying she stole me gold and money, which she didn't do it, and she didn't get paid for 1 year and 8 months. So if the government or the powerful people, if they deny or if they reject this new contract, how we gonna abolish the system? Who gonna work on this? Who gonna take responsibility? Or we gonna continue like seeing those domestic workers going through this system and losing their life? Like, for how long we gonna practice this? I mean, we have to work. I mean, we have to use our mind. We have to think as a human being. And the discrimination that we are facing, and they are racist. And when you go to the shop, when you go to on the street, everywhere they harass us, and they discriminate, or you know, the way how even like the talk about the domestic workers, which is, you know, it's unprofessional. So in my opinion, like, we have to fight as human beings to abolish the system, or to have a new contract, or to include a domestic workers in labor law. And everyone can take, I mean, it's everyone's responsibility this. What if this happened to my mom or my sister? Okay, so I mean, how many Lebanese people they are working outside of Lebanon? Many. In Canada, Africa. How many Lebanese working in Ghana? So what these things happen to them, or what if we have as African, or if we have as Ethiopian, if we have this system, and if we abuse one Lebanese workers, that make feel good to you? No. So we have to think in that way, and we have to work to abolish the system. Even, you know, under the Kafala system, even you don't have a right to keep your passport, your identity with yourself. It's a big shame. I mean, shame on you. I mean, I'm saying for the government, even for the Lebanese people, they have to speak up about it. We shouldn't feel comfortable with the system.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I think, you know, you're absolutely right. There must be a change at some point, and just kind of working towards that with the organizations and the initiatives and the individuals who are on the ground. And I think, you know, just supporting in any way that we can is vital. And I'll just pose the same question to you, Karim. So this idea of Lebanese state and political system of discrimination, what, in your opinion, is the purpose of this legalized discriminatory system for the non-Lebanese communities?
Yeah, so, you know, just to pick up from where Islam Sagrida left off, and hopefully I don't, you know, I don't kind of cross with them again. But, you know, there is a really important component of maintaining what Islam, I think, really aptly described as, you know, two viewpoints of marginalized, let's say, communities as people without agency, whether they're seen as outlaws and a security threat, or whether they're seen in a more, you know, oh, they're people who need aid, which, you know, is, you know, perhaps it's the intention is good there, but they're also seen as these people with no agency whatsoever. I think maintaining that sort of thing is really important to maintain structures of power. Any sort of positive development for their basic labor, human, social, culture, economic rights, you name it, would be seen as perhaps a stepping stone for asking for more, asking to be, you know, equal, which of course would have negative repercussions on those who profit off it. One, people profit off the exploitation of labor anywhere in the world, especially people that don't have any of the benefits or do not benefit under the labor law whatsoever. And of course, there is also the fact that in the case of the Kafala system, you do have recruitment agencies. It's a lucrative business in Lebanon. They have their own syndicate. If there are rights to actually protect these workers and to treat them with dignity and under, you know, fair and just labor standards, then it would impact their business. I mean, it boils down to that. Of course, as well, I think, you know, we have seen in recent years and that there has been lots, especially through the feminist movements, in my opinion, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you know, my fellow panelists or anybody who's tuning in, but it does seem that there has been solidarity between different women, whether it's Lebanese women fighting for a just domestic violence law or the right to pass nationality, to migrant domestic workers asking, you know, for their basic labor rights, to Palestinian and Syrian women as well. I mean, not across the board, but you've seen some sort of organizing together. There have been alternative Workers' Day marches that include them. Migrant workers are being supported by some local allies, being included in the Women's Day marches as well. And I think that's something that the powers that be or the establishment in Lebanon don't want at all. You know, they want different communities to be divided under different special legal frameworks of their own or different systems of their own, because if they band together, they can actually build momentum and have a really strong grassroots base, in my opinion, for their basic rights. And of course, if they ask for their basic rights, it could cause a problem for sectarian system, even though these are people that work and they contribute to the economy, they spend money in Lebanon. But, you know, this is kind of how I see it in a more sort of structural framework. It's profitable to exploit people, unfortunately, in a capitalist society. Keeping people divided under different legal frameworks prevents any form of ability to unionize or to band together and to fight for their basic rights. And of course, under the sectarian system, there is a fear that if people get basic rights, it could lead to other things, even though it's the right thing, but it's not compatible with Lebanon's sectarian system to include people that would shift the demographic situation in Lebanon.
Thank you, Karim, for that insight. So I'll move on to the next question, which I'll address first to Sagrida, but also ask Islam. Sagrida, in light of all these kind of very difficult situations that you've described and the systemic discrimination that exists, how have the migrant workers responded and organized in the face of these policies and in the face of the current crises that face Lebanon today?
Okay, thank you. I mean, to organize even as a domestic worker isn't something easy because many domestic workers they are live-in workers and they don't have day off to organize or to do some kind of movement and to support each other, which is the live-out workers. They are freelancers. Some of them they call runaway, which is they are not runaway. They ran away or they left the house because of the abuses and they couldn't able to respond back for the abuses that happen, or because of they cannot survive. That's the reason why they left the house and working outside. So those domestic workers, they organize, which is there's different places to organize. Like MCC now they shut down because of the corona pandemic, just for our safety. So we used to organize at the MCC, and they used to encourage us, which is I really appreciate and respect, because as Inya Linya, we organized and we came from MCC, so it's our roots to grow up in Migrant Community Center. So this is how we organize, and here we are supporting thousands of domestic workers financially, and also doing educational videos and protesting against of the system and to support each other. And we are not supporting just Ethiopians. We support all immigrant domestic workers in this country. The problem, it's becoming worse every day because of the economic crisis that happened last year. It gave us more headache beside the system, because many good employers, they used to pay their wage on time, but because of lack, they don't have dollars, or because of they don't have enough money, they start paying for domestic workers that they have inside the house. The live-out workers, they used to work in a company, as I mentioned before, inside different places, business markets and different places. So they are not getting paid on time because of those employers, they don't have money. And some of them, they stopped working because of the economic crisis. So those people, those immigrant domestic workers, they need food to eat. They need money to pay their house rent. And also there is they don't have access for medical. If you don't have a paper, some hospitals, they don't accept, to be treated or to get the medical treatment. That's a huge problem. And also there are single moms, which is they have babies because of the rape or because of the bad condition, that when they left their employer houses, they don't know nobody, they don't have friends, or they don't have phones to call. When they work inside the house, some of the, I can say that 65% of domestic workers, they don't have access for the phone. So when she left that house, maybe she don't know nobody, and man will take advantage of her. He will say that I can help you, or you can find a nice job, or you will stay with me. At that time, he will rape her, or he will use her. And after that, she ended up pregnant and giving the babies. So after, the economic crisis, they cannot able to work and feed their babies. Or because of the economic crisis, many family, they divorce. For example, the Syrian man, the Sudan man has a wife, she's Ethiopian, and they don't have work. He will go to this country, or the Syrian husband, he will disappear or something because he cannot provide for his family. So these single moms, they need money, they need food. The babies will not say, "Mom, you don't have money and I cannot eat," or I will wait for you until you give me food." They are babies, they don't understand. So what we react as activists, as Inya in this country, I mean, we start with what we have, and we start supporting. After the corona pandemic, we just take action, at least to provide dry food for the immigrant domestic workers, because nobody will look after the domestic workers. Nobody cares. I mean, I cannot say nobody. There are many activists and there are many NGOs that who cares our domestic workers, and they are a voice. Also, we are a voice for the voiceless domestic workers. So after the corona pandemic, we start just organizing and using the social media platform, our page, and sharing what we are doing, and we get many supports from Lebanese and non-Lebanese outside of partners. We are really grateful for your support. I mean, I have to say thank you. So yeah, and the things it's worse. There's also that what happened on August 4, maybe the explosion. And after that blast, many immigrant domestic workers, they lose their home, their job, their money, what they have, and they end up homeless. So those homeless domestic workers, they don't have nowhere to go. If I'm Lebanese, if I lost my house, I might have friends somewhere. I might go to Jebel and, outside of Beirut. But those domestic workers, they don't have nowhere to go. And the current situation, what's trapped us now, it's more than we can explain. And after the blast, many domestic workers, they end up on the street. They end up crying just to leave the country. If they want to leave the country, their system, they need permission to leave the country from their employer. Otherwise, they will end up in jail. They cannot go out. Even if they have money to buy their ticket, they cannot. There's legal things, which is still they are playing, saying you need a permission to leave the country. I mean, it's not a right time. Even they have to, say if you have money just to provide for your ticket, just leave the country. Why we have to play around? We need permission, or you have accusation and blah blah. I'm sorry, like I mean, it's not a right time. The general security, the government, they have to work in this. How many domestic workers are on the street? But in 2 months ago, there was Kenyan protesting in front of their embassy, Ethiopian sleeping on the street, the Sudanese sleeping on the street, the Bangladesh, the Sri Lanka, all the community. The current situation, it's more than we explain. And even the Lebanese people, they are suffering. They come to our place after the blast. Like, we had many Lebanese people just asking for food, for dry food, because of the blast. What happened? They cannot provide even for their kids. So why they don't give us give permission for domestic workers that who wants to leave the country? Let them go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Thank
I mean, if we talk, we need like an hour, but this is what I have to, that I can say. And yeah.
No, I think I think it's very, very important for everyone to be aware of these specific issues, but the more general system as well that has created these realities and these tragic situations on the ground for so many communities and people. And thank you for all the work that you do and your organization, that helps them. And the same question to you, Islam. So in terms of the Palestinian community, how have they responded and organized in the face of these policies and the current crises?
I'm always amazed by Sigrida and Lania's work, and I feel like just amazing and inspiring as always. I'm just gonna summarize what some of the initiatives that have been taking place in the Palestinian community. I've already mentioned that but people sort of operate in an informal network of sorts. So there has been a lot of initiatives that sort of came to be during COVID and the lockdown. So there were a lot of fundraisers to sort of provide financial assistance or food and care packages to people. There were a lot of initiatives at distributing masks, sort of raising awareness around COVID, helping people access like hospitals and treatment, because at first NRO wasn't really clear what they're planning to do when it comes to COVID-19 and treatment, and they sort of came up with their emergency plans 2 months after the first lockdown. So people did it themselves. There were a lot of, the civil defense teams in the camps, whether in Al Hilwa or Barjul Barajne, organized a lot of not just fundraisers, but also like preventive measures. They were doing the work that should be done by local Palestinian authorities or the government that said they were preparing people. Also in terms of transportation, when it comes to access testing spaces, also establishing quarantine spaces inside and outside the camp. So they have been focusing on this kind of work. But also in terms of crisis, there have been a lot of civil groups who have been doing like work related to support the informal economy, whether helping people buy masks from locally made masks and other services as well, teaching services. So this sort of communal initiative has been going on since 2019, actually, with the rise of prices. In many camps, for example, in Al Hilwa and Nahr al Barid, there has been like a local sort of kitchen where they distribute food. I'm not sure if this has been suspended due to the recent lockdown, but so most of these initiatives are being done by civil society and civil groups within the Palestinian community. Najdi has set up a hotline for women. Tadaman has also been doing a lot of work on providing services specifically for women. And there has been also a lot of new media initiatives, which I feel very interesting because they sort of, they're sort of explaining the situations, sharing information. So a lot of this work has been already done, as I've mentioned before, but it's sort of being renewed again with the second lockdown.
Thank you so much, both of you. And then we have one final question that I'll pose to all of the speakers. So this was touched upon throughout, of course, but specifically, in your opinion, each of your opinions, did the demands of the protests that erupted in October 2019 correspond to the needs of Palestinian community, the migrant workers and the Syrian communities, and how involved were these non-Lebanese communities in the protests? So again, if I can begin with you, Sigrida, please.
Okay, thank you. So I had a hope when the revolution started back in 2019, which is they give us hope saying it might change all this systematic thing, and hopefully we're gonna reach our dream, or all the human beings will equally treated in this country. This was my hope. But yeah, I saw one comment before, the revolution is for everyone, but I didn't see that, because I used to go to protest with MCC staff workers, and they harassed me there. There was like, I mean, the way how they, discriminate me, or the way how they used to talk about me, like, and it wasn't even as safe to go downtown to protest. So I used to cover my full face, just my eyes, and that's. That's something crazy, because in my opinion, it should be for everybody. When we have a protest, when NC organized the labor law and protest or something, we used to go, all the domestic workers, immigrant domestic workers, and having the banner and everything. That was beautiful. But in the revolution, I used to expecting to see that, but didn't happen. And I went down, and they harassed me and saying like, leave from here, go into Sri Lanka, and insulting me. That's why I left the protest, and I couldn't able to go more than 3 days. So, I don't know what miracle can change the system, or I don't know how the Lebanese people mentality will change. I'm not saying all the Lebanese. We have good Lebanese people beside us. They are supporting and encouraging us, and through this difficult time, they are organizing and doing fundraising and getting many donations. From Lebanese open-minded and great Lebanese people, we are getting many support. So I'm not saying those. I'm saying the evil ones. I'm sorry for my word. Yeah, really, we have. I have a lot of experience talking about the bad abuser or bad employers, or the bad system. And I think it's enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sigrid. And I think it's important to highlight that, maybe even within the protests themselves, that there was exclusion for certain communities, even within the revolution itself. So that's important, I think, to highlight and be aware of. And Karim, if you can speak to the idea of how the demands, if at all, have been met or correspond to the needs of the Palestinian migrant and non-Lebanese communities.
To be honest, I think Islam should speak on this before me. I think she would have more insight on. No?
We will be coming to Islam after you. We were going to just come to you and then Islam after.
Okay, that's fine then. Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at sort of demands and what people were talking about during the uprising, there was no mention of ending the Kafala. So there was no mention about ending the systematic racism and discriminatory practice against Palestinian refugees or Syrian refugees or what have you. And I think, to be frank, I did not expect this to be brought up in protest squares outside of Beirut. I did not expect to see this in Tripoli. I did not expect to see this in Jal Deep. I did not expect to see this anywhere else, to be frank. Not necessarily in Beirut either. There were people I know from MCC and from other people who, try to fight back against this kind of racist discourse. For example, after the first or second night of riots, the first 2 people who died in the uprising were 2 Syrian construction workers who died in a fire in a building. And, there was a group of people, albeit a small one, that paid tribute to them. And they spoke against, xenophobia and the abuses towards Syrian workers and the conditions that they live in, including these 2 construction workers who passed away and are often not talked about in the mainstream discourse. At the same time, it shows the sad state of affairs in Lebanon right now, when the fact that people see a big step forward in talking about, civil states, services for all, breaking down sectarian boundaries. It is, in fact, in terms of what the political situation in Lebanon looks like, is a step forward, but it only really scratches the surface of the problems that Lebanon goes through, unfortunately. If I could have one positive input on the matter, is that while there is indeed, an exclusion of non-Lebanese communities in Lebanon, who of course are a big part of our community, they did not actively target non-Lebanese communities in their discourse. I thought they were going to play a huge role in that by saying we need to send refugees home, or we need to let go of people. Especially because since 2016, I would say, there have been active campaigns against refugees, whether it's the whole, let's send the Syrian refugees back home to these so-called safe zones, or whether it's the crackdown on informal labor, as Islam talked about earlier, by saying they're taking all your jobs. Unemployment's because of this illegal labor, not because, our policies are terrible, right? And people didn't really take the bait for that, in the sense that it was not part of the dominant discourse. They focused on political leadership, they focused on the banks, they focused on the central bank, they focused on the sectarian system. So when they talked about unemployment, they weren't saying, why aren't the rulers sending refugee homes to end our economic crisis? They weren't. This discourse wasn't there. Even though there were attempts to bring it up when Gibran Bassil spoke and when other political leaders spoke, they did say that Lebanon's going through an unprecedented crisis. We're being held hostage by the international community to keep refugees here, and they're taking all your jobs and so on. But people didn't really buy that, or they did not integrate this hostile rhetoric in the heat of the moment of the protests, which I see as a somewhat positive thing. Of course, it is very unfortunate and it is wrong that they were not included, but I was pleasantly surprised that this hostile rhetoric that has been ingrained through the Lebanese media and through the political parties over the past through the past almost decade, I guess, especially since Syrian refugees began to come to Lebanon, it has not translated into the mainstream discourse against refugees. Of course, there's people who have used this hostile rhetoric, but it was not part of it did not it did not dominate the language, in my opinion. I could be wrong. This was just based on what I've sort of seen when I would go down and cover and speak to people. I might be wrong, but it appeared that they did not fall for that.
Thank you so much for that, Karim. And finally, the same question, Islam, just to wrap up the questions that I will be asking before we move on to the audience questions.
Yeah, so I sort of agree with some of the points that were mentioned. To me, I feel like the Lebanese uprising was definitely Lebanese-centric, and that's not an issue. What's an issue to me is, first of all, just quick disclaimer, what I'm saying is not representative of what every Palestinian in Lebanon thinks, because more often than not, we're Swedes into one box. So I sort of, so the Lebanese uprising was very Lebanese-centric, and that's fine. I mean, what's not fine is to assume that it wasn't, right? So although, yes, there were small groups and small initiatives, slogans, and all of this sort of efforts to include refugees as a general umbrella in many of the slogans and the chants and many of the statements that several initiatives and groups released, and that effort did not really go beyond beyond this, especially that it was coming right after a month of complete silence on the, of course, it was during the Palestinian uprising, but it was like sort of this phase, month of September until mid-October, where there were complete silence about what happened in months before. No mention of any camps uprising, no mention of any sort of, no questioning of what happened. How did all of this suddenly erupt and then suddenly die? So to me, personally, I felt like all of these efforts to sort of integrate refugees as an umbrella into this uprising was not really, what was artificial at best, because these were not the efforts that we should be looking for. And I think that to talk about this in a way that is constructive and not in a way that is, okay, you excluded us by, but more of it, of course, Palestinians were present informally, because we've never been formally acknowledged anyway. And of course, there were many communities present, and of course, many people tried to sort of integrate refugee rights within their discourse, but many of these slogans and initiatives, although appreciated and needed, of course, summarize a prevalent discourse in Lebanon, and that is viewing racism as simply a hate crime with no perpetrators. It is not structural, or it is structural, but we talk about it in terms that are not really contextualized. And to me, solidarity should be uncomfortable, right? It should be hard. It shouldn't be this easy to sort of say, we've said this and so. So to me, the uprising was a space for us to practice uncomfortable solidarity, a solidarity that challenges people, that challenges us first and foremost, and challenges progressive groups and challenges authorities. And so to say that this sort of solidarity was there makes me a bit wary of how we're talking. So most of what I'm saying is to sort of say that the Lebanese uprising came after months of, people feeling uncomfortable about the Palestinian uprising, having a lot of questions, because it challenged everyone. It challenged us, it challenged authorities, it challenged political factions, it challenged everyone. So when I think of whether or not the Lebanese uprising sort of, responded to the needs, it sort of makes me feel a bit, weird and alienated, because to me, it wasn't about that. To me, I did not expect the Lebanese uprising to respond to any, needs mentioned. And I feel like the problem is how we always expect it to do so, because we do not recognize non-Lebanese centric uprisings as actual uprisings or as actual revolts, because we always continue to define them but by what they are not, right? We always say non-citizen and non-Lebanese. So we sort of strip them of whatever legitimacy. So this is like my issue when talking about the space of non-citizen within the Lebanese uprising. And just to to end this on a good positive note, I think the question we should ask ourselves now, a year and a half, no, not a half, I don't know how many have passed since then, a year since the uprising, I think we should ask ourselves if Palestinians had a space within the uprising, but why didn't, I don't know, I'm just trying to be constructive, so I'm not going to ask this question. So I'm just going to end it on a positive note and say that, Palestinians were there informally, as we always have, and we were uncomfortable to people, which is great. This is exactly what we want. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Islam, and all of you, and thank you for ending it on a positive,
very positive
note. It was, I think, for me personally, extremely insightful and informative, and shocking, actually, to hear and learn some of the things. But I think that's, discomfort is good, because the hope is that discomfort will lead to action. And so thank you all for the wonderful insights that you've given us. Now we're going to open up the floor to some questions from our audience. We would love to answer them all, but unfortunately, because of time constraints and our delayed start, we will get to a few of them, but probably not too many. So apologies in advance. I'm just going to see which questions I have here at the bottom of my screen with the votes. Just give me one moment. Okay, so we have a question here from Craig. And the question is, how has the current crisis influenced the situation of migrant domestic workers? And is this situation comparable to what migrant domestic workers experienced during the 2006 war? If so, how? So I will ask Sigrid, please, to answer the question.
I think she mentioned about 2006 war. That's what.
Yeah.
I have no idea about the. I mean, I came, in 2015, maybe 16. I don't know. I mean, so I don't have the full information about the war or after the war. But as I tried to talk about before, now in current situation, as immigrant domestic workers in this country, after the economic crisis, after the corona pandemic, and after the blast, the life that we are experiencing now, it's give us depression for all of us, not just for immigrant domestic workers in this country. It's include everybody. So it make worse for domestic workers, because if they don't have money and work, they cannot able to survive and live in this country. So the main solution that I can say, it's just to leave the country, which is they cannot able to provide for their tickets. Also, there is PCR expense, which is they cannot able to provide also that. As Inya, we are well organized organization, so we are providing what we have. Also, many other NGOs, as this is Lebanon anti-racism movement and others, also they are supporting IOM, and globally we are getting a support as immigrant domestic workers, which isn't enough. There's legal things, and we need powerful people who have a power to push the system to not, push us back to not stay in the country. They have to let us freely without asking for permission from employers. So yeah, that's all.
Okay, thank you so much, Sigrida. If Karim or Islam, if you would like to comment, if you have any further. No, you're okay. Okay, so I'll move on to our next question, which has been posted by Atika. So the question says, among migrant communities, is there a difference in the way different nationalities or ethnicities are treated in relation to the state and by the Lebanese people? So again, if I can invite Sigrida to answer the question, and then open it up to Karim and Islam.
Yeah, such a nice question, thank you. Because if we go detailedly, I can mention a lot. If we take Filipinos, they are treated, a bit not that like others, like Ethiopians or other nationalities, because they speak well English, and they have a good experience, or they are not like Ethiopians. If we go to the Ethiopians nationalities, most of the domestic workers, they are coming from a village, and they are coming from farmer families, which is the agents. They are playing this role to traffic the underage Ethiopians domestic workers, which is they don't have no experience working as a helper, or they don't have that experience working and taking responsibility. Many of them, they are coming underage, and they treat in low class people, the Ethiopians and Sri Lankans, and it's something, it's like crazy. They treat even the salary that they give for pay for Filipino, it's $400, $500. It was before. The Ethiopians, their salary is $150. you know, which is it's always, you know, I ask why this happened. I mean, all the immigrant domestic workers, they are under the Kafala system. They shouldn't. They should pay the minimum wage, and they should have that system instead of paying for the Filipino $400 and paying 150 for Ethiopians. They don't treat equally, even the way how they discriminate or abuse. It's different. I can give you a real story. Two helpers, they work in the same employer house. One she's one she's Filipino, the other she's Ethiopian. The Filipino, she has her phone. She has a phone, and she has a right to use her phone. She has access to talk to her parents, and she receives her salary on time. The Ethiopian, she works 24/7, and she doesn't have a phone, and she don't have a right to talk to her parents, and she didn't get paid for 3 years. And now we are looking to find her. And the Filipino workers, she tried to help the Ethiopian. She just called me and said, you know, she's not getting her salary and I cannot help her. I mean, she's the workers too. And the way how they treat domestic workers, immigrant domestic workers in this country, as an equal. They put high class level workers and the Ethiopians, the Bangladeshi, the Sri Lanka, and, you know, they don't treat even equally the immigrant domestic workers. And the way how they discriminate and insult, even it's, you know, it's different.
Thank you. Thank you, Sigrid, for that. If Islam or Karim have any comments or contributions. Yeah, it's very interesting to realize there's a hierarchy of discrimination as well within that. I think we have just one more question. It's actually two questions, but they're similar, so I'm going to kind of try to present them as one. So Christina has asked about kind of this issue of kafala, and of course, you know, generally the broader system of discrimination that exists within the political system in Lebanon. Since there seems to be a roadblock in changing the system internally, in your opinion, so I'll pose this question to all our speakers, is there value in involving countries of origin, so kind of the home countries where migrant workers or where refugees might be displaced from, and also the international community more heavily to put pressure on the Lebanese government? So again, within the same kind of idea, would the PLO, for example, be a good option to kind of defer to help realize Palestinian rights, as well as embassies and other governments from countries of origin? So Islam, if you'd like to maybe start and answer that.
Yeah, so to be honest, I see no point in any sort of collaboration or organizing or sort of communicating with the PLO, because when the Palestinian uprising in 2019 was, you know, the PLO basically sort of said that we are guests, and it was a public speech, a statement by Azam al-Ahmad, who met with the Minister of Labor and then said a statement in which he basically reminded us that we are guests and, you know, we are working on this, and the Palestinian factions in collaboration are going to fix this. And, you know, so to me, to be honest, I'm going to answer as short, you know, to summarize as possible. To me, I really feel like the way we react as communities and as movements and as collectives, regardless of where we're at and which part of the world we are, would be more beneficial to me than any statement coming from the PLO for various reasons, as a Palestinian feminist who has lived here all her life. So to me, yes, I do believe that pressure could definitely work, and pressure has different, you know, forms. It's not just about pressuring the government, but also sort of acknowledging and giving legitimacy to the protests that Palestinians are leading and other communities are leading in Lebanon. And this is sort of what was missing during the Palestinian uprising, unfortunately. And I feel like this space, for example, is another space in how we connect. So to me, movements, collectives how they respond and acknowledge what we're doing would definitely add a lot of pressure, and would definitely give people a push to continue working, because the only legitimate representative of us is the PLO, which most of us, again, I'm not going to speak on behalf of all Palestinians, to some of us is an illegitimate establishment and entity. So.
Okay. Thank you very much, Islam. And I'll pose the same question to you, Sigrid, but to speak about the potential role of the home countries of the migrant workers in trying to change the system in Lebanon.
Okay, so the home country, well, like we sent the letter for our prime minister 2 years ago, maybe, or 1 year ago. So the solution or the answer that we gave, they said we don't have agreement between Lebanon and Ethiopia. We didn't sign that agreement, and because of that, we cannot pressure the Lebanese government or the Lebanese. They cannot put the pressure and do the negotiation or to have that legal protection for Ethiopian domestic workers as Ethiopian. So this is what the answer that we gave. And if I speak about others, like when we take workshops from different NGOs, they mention about Convention 189, if I'm right, I don't know. Yeah, Convention 189. They said Lebanon, they didn't sign the Convention 189, and the Filipino government, in their country, they signed the Convention 189. That's why they are treating good, or they are getting their minimum wage of payment. That's what the information that I get from the people that they have, the power, or the people who working on this thing. So what our government can do is just, paying or doing the massive repatriation, covering for his citizen to leave the country. This is the good solution right now. But if I mention about others, origin, if, for example, how many, like here, immigrant domestic workers, they are coming from different countries, different African. If those all, if they organize, the prime ministers, the powerful people, UN, or worldwide, if they put pressure on Lebanese government, we can see a change. But now, I want to say, I have to say thank you for journalists that who's working now and writing articles about domestic workers and the different social media, and so they are playing a role now to address the domestic workers' life in this country. And now worldwide, people, they are reading and listening to the real story, what's happening in the country after the explosion, the corona pandemic, after the economic crisis. So in my opinion, if all the, worldwide, if they put pressure on Lebanese government, we can see a change, because they have a power to do that. Not just our government. Our government, they said, we don't have agreement and we cannot put pressure. But they can do the massive repatriation, paying for domestic workers who wants to leave the country.
Yes, thank you so much, Sagrida. And finally, I'll pose the question to Karim, specifically to pick up on the last point that Sagrida made. In your opinion, would the international community putting pressure on the Lebanese government result in any meaningful change in your opinion?
I mean, I have to agree with Sagrida on this. I think that, considering that workers on the Kafala system come from well over a dozen countries, if they did band together and sort of, pressure the Lebanese government, they would for sure. Again, this is a very lucrative economy for Lebanon. Lebanon's reputation is getting worse more than ever. For the longest time, it was seen as an exception to many other more overtly authoritarian countries in the Middle East, and people don't see that anymore. They're seeing right through it, more so than before, at least. And also at the same time, in many of these countries, there is Lebanese diaspora that are trying to make money on their own. Especially in Africa, many people in business and construction and so on. So there is a diplomatic effort that can be done. I think if these countries, got together and they did kind of pressure Lebanon on its Kafala system. At this point in time, each country is responding to their respective citizens differently. And the repatriation situation is a big example of it. So, Sudanese male workers who have been outside of their embassy in Beirut for months now have basically been ignored completely. Whereas, for example, the Ghanaian consulate, there have been the ambassador flew in from Egypt. He sent many, and we covered some of it, and we saw that he played a much more proactive approach, and apparently they have been trying to pressure the foreign ministry, for example, on these kinds of matters, whereas other countries have completely ignored or sort of just cast it aside. So, again, it's strength in numbers at the end of the day. And so I do see that kind of thing. I just want to kind of just pick up where Sagrida said, and I definitely agree.
Thank you for that response. And on that positive note, where in unity we can find strength and hopefully change, in the near future. I would like to kind of draw this to a close. Again, apologies for running slightly over, but it's been a fascinating talk and as I said, very, very informative. So we've reached the end of our talk today. I would like to thank you all, our speakers, very, very much for giving up your time and for giving us your very kind of thoughtful insights. We have now reposted the links to a selection of organizations that are doing brilliant work on the ground, helping all these communities. So please, our audience, if you can please consider lending your support to them. And thank you to everyone. Thank you to our audience who's joined us, for your time, your engagement, and your questions. If you enjoyed today's talk, please do support us by sharing our activities with your communities and joining us at our upcoming events. You can also follow us on social media. You can find us at Makan Rights on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. We will now have added all the registered audience members to our mailing list if you weren't already on it. So you'll be receiving updates on upcoming events and talks that we are hosting. And finally, just a reminder that we record all of our virtual talks with English subtitles added. So you'll be receiving a recording of today's talk in the next few days. And please do feel free to share this widely with your networks and communities as well. I think it's very important to get the word out there and to get people supporting these organizations as well. So thank you very much to our speakers. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you.